Welcome to The Explainer. So today we're jumping into something really cool, visual anthropology. We're going to explore how seeing is actually a super powerful way of understanding. But before we get into the weeds, let's just start with the big question, right? How can a simple camera become a tool for really understanding a culture? I mean, how do you go from just snapping a photo to creating actual, anthropological knowledge? How does that little box evolve from just a recording device into a tool for genuine discovery? Okay, so here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll define what we're even talking about. Then we'll look at how the field evolves, get into some of the core theories, tackle the tricky politics of it all, and finally, see how it actually works out in the real world. All right, first up, let's get a handle on what visual anthropology actually is. And spoiler alert, it is way more than just taking pretty pictures. Think of it like this. It's a two-way street. So on one side of the street, we're using all the tools of anthropology to study visual stuff, like films, photos, even what you see on social media. But on the other side, we're actually using those same visual things, cameras, video, as tools to do our research and get a better handle on culture. And what's kind of wild is that people can't even agree on what to call it. I mean, the name itself is up for debate. You've got Margaret Mead, who coined visual anthropology back in the 60s, which really became about using cameras to document cultures. But then you have scholars like Jay Ruby who say, hang on, that's too narrow. He preferred anthropology of visual communication, which is this much broader idea that includes everything humans make for others to see. We're talking everything from facial expressions to blockbuster films. And this isn't just wordplay, right? It cuts to a really deep question. Is this field about using a camera on people, or is it about studying absolutely everything we see as a form of culture? It just goes to show you how alive and contested this whole field is. And honestly, that whole debate about the name makes a lot more sense when you look at the field's history. It's been a real roller coaster, and its story pretty much mirrors the evolution of anthropology as a whole. Yeah, this timeline really lays it all out. You start in the late 1800s with folks like Malinowski using cameras as this scientific tool, often to document what they called primitive cultures, which, is a whole can of worms we'll get into. Then, bam, you hit this dark age in the mid-20th century. Visuals just fell off the map because everyone got really focused on abstract stuff like social structures, and hey, film was super expensive. But then the 80s hit, and everything changed with a reflexive turn. This was huge. Anthropologists started to seriously question their own objectivity. They asked, wait, who am I to be filming this? And that led to much more collaborative, self-aware work. Which of course brings us to right now, the digital age, where basically everyone has a high-quality camera in their pocket. This has completely changed the game, making visuals a core part of mainstream anthropology and pushing it into all sorts of new and exciting directions. So that whole journey from I'm an objective scientist with a camera to, wow, this is a complicated, self-aware practice, that didn't just happen out of nowhere. It was fueled by some really powerful new ideas, some big theories that made researchers stop and ask, hold on, what even is an image? And what is it actually doing when we look at it? Okay, so one of the big ones is semiotics. The easiest way to think about it is like a visual language. Semiotics basically says an image has zero meaning on its own, none. Instead, we read it using a whole system of cultural codes and symbols that we've all learned over time. So the meaning isn't really in the photo itself. It's inside our heads and shaped by the culture we all share. And this leads to a really profound idea, put perfectly by the theorist Roland Barthes. He said, the birth of the reader must be at the cost of the death of the author. What he meant is that whatever the photographer intended to show us, well, it doesn't matter nearly as much as how we, the viewers, actually interpret it. Our own experiences, our own backgrounds, that's what creates the meaning. In a way, we become the real authors. And if that wasn't enough to bend your brain, then you've got Jean Baudrillard and his idea of hyperreality. His whole thing was that in our crazy, media-soaked world, the simulation of reality, the image, can become more real and more important than reality itself. Think about it, a picture of a burger in an ad that looks way more perfect and delicious than any burger you could ever actually get. The image doesn't just represent the real thing, it replaces it and, in a way, improves on it. So you take these two ideas together, semiotics and hyperreality, and they just completely blow up that old notion of a camera being a simple, truthful window on the world. And then there's power. You absolutely have to talk about power. This is really the idea that drove that whole reflexive turn we mentioned earlier. The philosopher Michel Foucault really hammered this home. The act of looking, what he called the gaze, is never neutral. There's always a power dynamic. So when an anthropologist points a camera at somebody, it's not a neutral act. It can turn that person into an object of study, a subject to be analyzed, instead of an equal partner in the process. And once you realize that, it forces you to constantly ask, okay, what am I seeing? Sure, but also, who is doing the looking, and what power do they hold? And look, anthropologists aren't the only ones thinking about this stuff. As you can see here, other fields bring their own toolkits to the table. Cultural geographers, for instance, they look at it in three parts: where the image was made, what's actually in it, and how different audiences react to it. Then you have cultural studies, which looks at the whole social life of an image, how it gets produced, how it spreads, how it's consumed, and how its meaning can completely change over time. All of this theory and talk of power leads us straight into the thorniest part of visual anthropology, the ethics and politics of it all. This is probably the biggest challenge anyone working in this field has to face. So the big question becomes, how do you avoid falling into what's called the representational trap? This is that huge danger of accidentally creating stereotypes or making people and their cultures seem exotic and strange, basically misrepresenting their lives because you're the outsider with the camera. You're the one telling the story. And these right here, these are the ethical landmines you're trying to dodge. Are you objectifying people? Are you playing into old colonial ideas of civilized versus primitive? Are you taking things out of context? And at the heart of it all is that power imbalance between you, the researcher, and the people you're researching. But what's so amazing is seeing how communities are fighting back against this. They're not just passive subjects anymore. No way. Indigenous groups are grabbing the cameras for themselves. You see communities like the Kayapo in Brazil filming their own rituals on their own terms. Or you see activists like the Zapatistas in Mexico who purposefully wear face masks. It's a brilliant move. It subverts that exotic gaze and makes it impossible for an outsider to create a simple, timeless stereotype of them. Okay, so we've got the history, we've got the heavy theories, we've got all these ethical minefields. With all of that in your head, how do you actually do this work? How does a visual anthropologist operate in the field? Well, the answer is a methodology called visual ethnography. This is where the rubber meets the road. It's the practical application of everything we've been talking about. It's a research method that uses media not just to record things, but as a real tool for discovery, for generating brand new insights about a culture. And as you can see, this isn't just about showing up and hitting record. It's a real process, a systematic one. You start with a very specific research question. Then you go out and collect visual data. And that can happen in a bunch of ways. Maybe you're filming spontaneous events, or maybe you're doing something called photo elicitation, where you show people photos and ask them to talk about them. It's a great way to get conversations going. After that, you've got to analyze everything using all those theories we talked about. And finally, you bring it all together, the visual and the written, to produce a richer, more layered understanding. And this last point is so important. The goal is not for the image to replace the text. They're not in competition. They're a team. They're complementary. A picture can show you something that words can't quite capture, right? But words can give you the context, the theory, the interpretation that a picture alone just can't provide. Each one makes the other stronger, creating a much deeper story. So that really leaves us with a final big question to think about. You know that old saying, a picture is worth 1,000 words? Well, visual anthropology kind of flips that and asks something more profound. What kind of new stories, what new understandings can we create when we powerfully combine both the picture and the words? It's right there, in that combination, that we can find totally new ways of seeing and sharing what it means to be human.